Hello, I'm Finlay Macdonald and you're watching Talk Talk, the show where only the title repeats itself. Later on we'll have a song from a special musical guest, but first, some talking. According to a recent survey, our guest is the third most trusted person in New Zealand, which is an unusual thing for a scientist to be. But he is an unusual scientist, one who is connected with us in a way scientists rarely do. He is Professor Sir Paul Callaghan, and I'm very pleased to welcome him to Talk Talk. Hello, Paul.
Hi.
What did you make of that Reader's Digest survey?
Well, it was a very strange thing, wasn't it? And what does it say about the country that 3 scientists come out as the most trusted people?
That's right, and you were only third.
I was only third, yes. But look, Ray Avery and Peter Glutton, they're great people, so I'm very happy to be in their wake.
What does it say about the country that scientists are our most trusted people
I don't know. I mean, I think Reader's Digest changed their methodology a little bit this year, and they got a surprising outcome, and that was something that generated a lot of publicity, which is really nice. But I guess that science has had a much higher profile in recent years, and both Peter and Ray have been sort of outstanding communicators in science, and so I guess there's just a greater exposure of science out there at the moment.
Scientists are becoming celebrities. I mean, you're a New Zealander of the Year as well. And the previous one was a scientist as well. What is this telling us about ourselves?
Well, I really don't know. I think I'd like to think it reflects New Zealanders looking in a little different way about their future and where we're going as a country, and that maybe science has something to offer in terms of a direction.
You think this fixation with celebrity might actually be on the wane?
I don't know. Celebrity is a very strange phenomenon.
I'm just thinking of people going into science instead of wanting to be television presenters or models.
Yeah.
See any sign of that?
Yeah, well, the public have a kind of a strange view of scientists as being pointy-headed people who are kind of a bit autistic, who hide away in their laboratories and so forth. But, of course, in truth, science is a very social activity. It's always done with groups of people communicating. And part of the role of being an effective scientist is to explain your science to other scientists, and that requires communication skills. But I think that the idea of science having a responsibility to get out there and communicate with the public at large is relatively recent. And in New Zealand, it really started with Alan MacDiarmid, who, after he won the Nobel Prize, did this lecture tour of New Zealand, and he had capacity audiences, and he held them spellbound, and it was quite clear then that New Zealanders were very interested in science.
When was that?
That was 2001, and it's really when I got involved. I think I was inspired by Alan's example to think, well, you know, maybe I could talk a little bit more about that, and I got involved with Kim Hill, talking on radio and so forth, and the response was really very positive, and it's clear that New Zealanders do have a real interest and a capacity to understand and take an interest in science.
That's what inspired you to start communicating about science. What inspired you to get into science in the first place?
Look, I was a child of the 50s, and it was the world of Wanganui, you know, like most of small-town New Zealand, where kids ran wild. You know, boys made their own activities outdoors. We made boats in the river. We made telephones, crystal sets, explosives, you know. We did stuff in the physical world, the natural world.
I hadn't actually thought of it like that, but in fact, that sort of childhood is sort of a scientific childhood in a sense, isn't it?
Yeah. I think kids growing up on farms have a lot of that too, interaction with the natural world. And these days it's very different. Kids have a much more of an indoor life focused around electronic media. You don't fix anything. Everything's sort of thrown away when it doesn't work. You know, there was a time when if you owned a motor car, you had to be able to repair it, get inside the bonnet. Now you open it up and you don't understand what on earth's going on in there. It's too mysterious. So that's the modern world.
There's a bit of a conundrum there, then, isn't there? I mean, we're on the one hand celebrating our scientists slightly more than we perhaps used to, and on the other hand we're taking away the conditions that would perhaps encourage them to become
But I think we're all
scientists.
aware of how much science and technology is part of our lives and is transforming our lives at an increasingly rapid rate. And so many of the decisions that we have to make as a society or in politics or around ethics concern the impact of science on our lives. You know, do we use drugs in sport? Do we have genetically modified organisms? Under what conditions? These are all challenges that we have to face. How do we deal with global climate change? They're all questions that ultimately are informed by science in some way, but in fact require some sort of ethical decision which science has no particular capacity in. And so all scientists can do is explain what's going on and then engage with the public, who ultimately have to be the arbiters of what we do and how we use science and technology.
When you were running around as a boy in the 50s in Wanganui, did you ever sort of suspect you might be grappling with concepts like this? Your parents, as far as I know, didn't even go to secondary school.
No, they didn't.
That's a big leap.
Yes, it was. Yes, I suppose.
How do you explain it?
Well, I think that most young people end up following some path almost by accident, and I certainly did. And when I was at school, it wasn't just science that interested me. In fact, my favourite subject at school was English.
All specialist fields, I think at one level, are actually just about learning a new vocabulary, aren't they?
They are, yeah. And I think, the medical profession would be a great example of that now. There's a great challenge for physicians to be able to talk with their patients in a much more open and engaged way than was ever the case in the past. The idea of professions being up on a pedestal as some sort of a mysterious thing, people don't wear that anymore. In fact, you can go to your doctor having been well informed beforehand by having gone to the internet, and you may well be having a conversation with your physician in which you possibly know more about your particular condition than he or she does.
Yes, because you've been on the internet.
Absolutely. That's the world we live in, and I love it. I love that world where that information is available to everyone. So I think that's the result of that is a much greater openness in all professions, and I think that's a great thing about the world we live in now.
Your big break, I guess, as a research scientist was getting a scholarship to Oxford, or it took you eventually to Oxford.
I think in retrospect I realised what a life-transforming experience that was. I didn't know it at the time, but...
I was going to say, did it set you on a certain path, a life path as well as a professional path?
It challenged me immediately, because I'm suddenly, here's this boy from Wanganui, I'd never been out of New Zealand, suddenly thrown in the middle of all these strange people who hold sherry glasses in their hand and have these sophisticated conversations, and I found that very challenging and very weird, and I kind of rebelled against it a little bit, until I came to learn that all that really mattered in Oxford was, could you cut the mustard intellectually? They didn't really care about where you came from, what funny way you spoke, what you looked like, what your religion was. It really was about capability, and it was an extremely liberating experience for me. There was
what about intellectually? What did it, as a scientist, what did you decide?
Well, I discovered my strength. I discovered areas where I was actually better than my other compatriots, and areas where I was weak, and there were a number of areas where I was weak. But I did find that I was able to meet the standards required, and that was, again, being in that sort of best-in-the-world environment and having to compete in that pool and discovering that you could manage and that you were doing okay. It was an incredible boost at one's confidence. And I say walking away from that experience of being at Oxford for 3 or 4 years just set me up to have a degree of sense of my own capability that I would never have had I not experienced that.
You say walking away from Oxford. I'm always intrigued by people who do walk away from places like that, because I can imagine you could have stayed.
I could have stayed, yeah.
I mean, no offence to Palmerston North, but you came back to Massey University.
I did. Well, I remember I had a transformational experience on the way to Oxford. I saw a 747 aircraft for the first time. I was sitting on the runway in Athens Airport. I couldn't believe the size of this plane. But it became apparent to me that it would be possible in the future to do international science based in New Zealand, that suddenly, instead of having 6-week boat journeys, you could take this aircraft across the world in a single hop in 24 hours and get to international conferences. So there were a number of us around that time in the early 70s who decided to cut a new path in science, which previously was that if you wanted to be a scientist, as Rutherford did or Alan MacDiarmid did, you left the country, you didn't come back.
You simply couldn't do that.
You couldn't do it. You couldn't. Well, you could possibly do some research, but journals took a long time to come. You couldn't get to international meetings. Nobody would come and visit you and work in your lab. It was all too far. And that changed dramatically with jet aircraft.
So you actually had that epiphany, you realised?
Well, it sort of started to dawn on me, and also I wanted to come home. I mean, I did have the opportunity to stay in Oxford. I could have...
Did you ever wonder what might have happened if you'd stayed in the UK?
Yeah, I think I know what would have happened. I would have had a life in science there, and I'd have always been a guest in somebody else's country. I mean, I wanted to be in my home. This is where I was born, and the challenge to do international science here was greater. That made it, in a way, somewhat harder, but the rewards were obviously going to be greater for me personally, because this is the pool in which I wanted to swim. This is just my natural environment.
That idea that you could be in New Zealand and study at an international level fits into your theory that science in New Zealand has basically been or run in 3 phases.
Yes, indeed.
The ones who left, the ones who could stay. What phase are we in now?
Well, I think we're moving into phase 3. So in phase 2, when we said, let's try to be international scientists in New Zealand, what were we all trying to do? We were trying to publish in the best journals. We wanted to go to the international meetings and show that we were doing great science and encourage top people to come and work in our labs from the rest of the world. So we had this totally international focus all the time. But at no time were we thinking, what difference is it making to our country? How is it transforming New Zealand? In a sense, we were kind of living this world outside, which didn't seem to connect. And the realisation that I came to a few years ago was, did it make any difference to New Zealand? I mean, Why should the taxpayer pay for me to be publishing in international journals? Or more pointedly, if we looked at the money that's spent on scientific research, and I've had a lot spent on me over the years, and you start to translate that into hip replacements or Herceptin breast cancer treatments, you would say, well, why would the taxpayer pay for Paul Callaghan to do his science and go to international meetings rather than have a few more hip replacements?
Well, that's the question. How do you answer it?
Well, I think there has to be an answer. And once you know the answer to that, then you've got some sort of realisation of the way in which your science connects.
To me, this is the point at which you realise you need to start addressing policy and strategy rather than pure science.
Well, I think for many years scientists had been saying, why don't we invest more as a country in this area? And the argument really turns around a value proposition, because I think if we're to be more than involved in a culture of complaint, we have to actually understand what it is that science does for New Zealand so we can make that argument. And so there are a number of steps along that path that I started to take. One was that I started to commercialise science myself. I got involved in setting up a company, and that was an interesting experience.
And would this have also involved your involvement with the Centres for Research Excellence?
Yes, that was the other factor, and that came about just after Alan McDiarmid's sort of triumphal return to New Zealand after the Nobel Prize, that the government coincidentally had set up a program of funding Centres of Research Excellence, and there was a competition for that, and I led one of those bids, and we were successful. That was the McDiarmid Institute for Advanced Materials.
Have you met resistance from those who feel that commercialising science is sort of vulgarising it?
Some scientists feel a little uncomfortable when I talk about, you know, the sort of money value of science, but I quite unashamedly have a belief that per capita GDP does matter to New Zealand, and that exports are important, and that if science can be translated into clear value in dollar terms, then there's nothing to be ashamed of in that. In fact, in some ways, there's no greater sincerity in the compliment paid by someone who's prepared to pay their money to buy your product. Prizes in science are all very nice. Accolades are fine, but there's nothing more sincere than a purchase, in my view. So I think that's one of the great rewards I discovered when we got involved in commercialisation, that here are these people around the world who wanted to buy your products. It was great.
I'm interested in hearing scientists talk about economics or macroeconomics, because economists like to think of themselves as scientists, but I'm a sceptic. Do you think it's a science?
I have a sort of a conflict with economists, and a lot of them feel very uncomfortable with someone like me talking about economics, and they say they don't talk about physics, I shouldn't talk about that subject. And I must admit I take a kind of a different view about economics than the traditional one. I'm much more interested in microeconomics. To me, economics is about a whole lot of collective individual human behaviours, the collective effect of that, when people make transactions and make decisions about what they buy or don't buy and so forth. And so I find that economics is ultimately really about human behaviour, and I think that's very, very interesting. And so if we looked at New Zealand's economic situation, I really do believe that we have it in our capacity to perform a whole lot better as a nation if we simply thought differently and started to behave in a different way. And one of the reasons I believe that is that our education system is world class, and yet it doesn't education CD in productivity.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the ways to get that debate going is to humanise the sciences more, to bring them. And correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the ways to get that debate going is to humanise the sciences more, to bring them. And I think one of the ways you've sort of done that at a personal level is to speak publicly about your cancer diagnosis, but from a scientific point of view. Was that deliberate?
Yes, it was, actually, and I talked with Kim Hill about that. I've done 3 interviews with Kim, and I've, of course, a number of other interviews and discussions with various media, but it was out of those conversations with Kim that she invited me back on after I'd done this science series with her, and we decided that it would be interesting to talk about it from the point of view of a scientist analysing their own condition. And it really reflected my own wish when I was diagnosed with cancer to try to treat it that way, to not be afraid of it, but to treat it as something that was interesting. So that as I went through this journey and the data suddenly told me bad things, I wouldn't be frightened by that. I would say, well, that's interesting, what does this mean? And I found that degree of detachment really quite interesting. I was fascinated when Dennis Potter, the playwright, referred to his cancer as Rupert, because he thought of the most malevolent identity he could, and of course Rupert Murdoch was that to him. But I've never thought of my cancer that way.
You haven't named it?
No, I call it Paul. It's just the misbehaving part of Paul, the sort of crazy, irresponsible part of perhaps my adolescence that is re-emerging in some way, and I've got get it to calm down and, you know, just be a little bit more reasonable.
I mean, I admire your rationality. You seem very sanguine about this. I take it you're not religious.
No, I'm not religious at all.
So science has its own consolations, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
Yes, but science doesn't really tell us how to live as a human being. So science has its limits to its capacity to inform human life about so many of the decisions we have to make. So I'm respectful of religion. I guess in that sense I'm a spiritual person, in that I am aware that there are mysteries out there that maybe even are beyond science. And I think the whole question of why are we alive, what is the purpose of our life, is one of the great mysteries we grapple with. And really that's the kind of the purpose of this journey we're on, is to make some discoveries around that. And being on a cancer journey actually helps a lot in that regard.
Well, I was going to say, does the scientist in you respond to having your mind focused by that?
Oh, it does, yes. I mean, I love the data that I get. I mean, I really believe the numbers that come out of the blood tests. I'm fascinated by the radiology. I love going inside those X-ray CT machines. And I've had, I think, 11 X-ray CTs and positron emission tomography scans and so forth. And I don't find those machines fearsome. I find them fascinating and beautiful.
So I imagine going through your cancer treatment, you've come in contact with people that you otherwise might not have, and learned all sorts of things.
Yes, I have. I've met the comrades, as I call them, fellow cancer sufferers, and I've deliberately sought their company, and the Cancer Society has made that possible because of the opportunity to meet with other people from different walks of life and ages, and to sit and listen to their stories. And it's really very helpful in this process. One of the things I always recommend to people who've been diagnosed with cancer is that they do that to learn about other people's cancer, to try to understand their stories as well. And I find that extremely helpful, just to be part of that group of remarkable individuals and to be inspired by their courage.
You know, you'd expect people to be quite fearful of a diagnosis like yours. In the funny way, people are fearful of science. And I think for the same reasons, because it's the unknown, and it's terrifying. We've got machinery, you've got people speaking in tongues, basically, you don't understand.
Sure.
How do you overcome that fear of science?
I think one of the values of science is that knowledge is never to be feared. There's an inherent, if you like, faith in science, that knowledge per se is never to be feared. And I feel if for me, approaching my disease, I've looked at it that way. I've wanted to learn as much about it as possible, what's happening inside me. And to be interested in it is to overcome the fear. I just find that works for me. I'm not saying it would for everybody, but it is part of the way that a scientist tends to look at the world. Nature is violent and cruel, and, you know, people in Christchurch know that, of course. Lives can be cut short very, very quickly, and that's the pattern of things. So to have life at all, to have life every day is something to be enjoyed and treasured.
And have you got more to do with the days that are left?
Yes, I have, and I'm trying to use them as well as I can. I don't know how many days I've got left, but I don't think I've lived life at such a level of appreciation and enjoyment, ironically, as I am now. I'm truly happy, and I'm truly enjoying everything that I'm doing, and I don't intend to waste a minute of it.
Well, long may it continue. Thanks very much, Sir Paul.
Thank you very much, Finlay.
After the break, a song from Victoria Girling-Butcher and her band.